Off the coast of Japan lies an underwater structure, possibly the work of a civilization that lived 10,000 years ago.
We may be on the edge of reading for the first time a missing chapter in the human story.
But is the monument actually the result of human ingenuity or natural geology?
Just because it looks like history doesn't mean it is.
The waters surrounding Yonaguni Island off the southwest coast of Japan are difficult to reach and even more difficult to dive. But the sapphire blue salt water of the East China Sea holds a bounty of natural wonders for those who come here. This undersea world has rarely been seen by people outside the tiny Japanese diving community that claims this part of the ocean for their own. In 1987, scuba instructor Kihachiro Aratake sets out to find ways to attract more divers to Yonaguni.
Nature amazes me. I see the fish and the many forms of sea life change here every day. So we were exploring diving points to use the ocean to attract tourists.
Kihachiro Aratake is looking for the breeding grounds of hammerhead sharks that populate the ocean here. He believes that the opportunity for divers to see these unique creatures close up will be his key to riches. But what Aratake discovers instead is even more unique, even more spectacular than anything he could have possibly imagined.
When I first saw it, I had goosebumps and felt strange, wondering why something like this exists underwater.
To Aratake, the stone megaliths he discovers look like the remnants of an ancient ceremonial structure.
When I saw this for the first time, it definitely looked like ruins. So I named it Iseki Point, Ruins Point.
Iseki Point is located in 80 feet of water, less than a half-mile off the coast of Yonaguni Island. Part of Japan's southernmost Ryukyu island chain, Yonaguni is a tiny jewel of an island, Japan's westernmost scrap of land, barely 100 miles east of Taiwan.
When I saw it for the first time, I had a strong impression of the pyramids, and I felt like I was in Egypt. It is a great mystery that there is such large object near such a small island.
Masaaki Kimura is a professor of physical sciences at the University of the Ryukyus in Okinawa, Japan. In 1992, he is the first scientist to explore and measure the underwater phenomenon.
This one is the body, yes. Okay.
The main structure is over 500 feet long, almost the length of 2 football fields, and taller than an 8-story building. To Kimura and his team, this is more than a collection of interesting rocks.
Our studies show proof that the monument is not artificial, but is man-made.
But Kimura's studies, published in Japanese and circulated only within his own academic community, failed to reach the West. Photographs are circulated on the World Wide Web, where they attract the attention of Western divers. The photographs of the monument also impress Graham Hancock, a former correspondent for The Economist and author of a series of books on Earth's oldest known structures. Hancock immediately takes a crash course in scuba diving so he can see the monument for himself.
My first impressions when I first saw the main underwater structure at Yonaguni were of complete awe. To see very clean, almost right-angled, sharp edges, to see every appearance of design and organization in a large stone structure underwater raised in me a tremendous sense of excitement and mystery. The closest parallel, I would say, is the kind of feeling that I get when I walk into a great cathedral or into the Great Pyramid of Egypt.
Since 1997, Hancock has made more than 150 dives at Yonaguni, discovering more than just a single stone monument.
We have specific, distinct structures with extremely puzzling, anomalous features that I believe cannot be explained by nature, found spread out along 5 kilometers of the southern coast of Yonaguni. And since they're all submerged, it suggests to me that they were all made at roughly the same time. I honestly think that we are looking at a huge ceremonial, ritual, religious area.
But the fact that the Yonaguni Monument is underwater raises an extremely difficult scientific question. If these stone structures were in fact created by humans, then they would have had to have been carved when the monument was above water. According to Kimura's estimates, that would date the ruins to the Ice Age, when sea levels were much lower because much of the world's water was still locked up in the ice fields of the northern hemisphere. That means that the last time the Yonaguni Monument was above water was approximately 8000 BC, predating Egypt's pyramids by more than 5,000 years.
The monument might be 10,000 years old or older, which would make it the oldest structure in the world.
But dating the Yonaguni Monument to the Ice Age flies in the face of the timeline currently accepted by mainstream archaeologists.
Large-scale man-made constructions of this nature require a level of organization and planning in society which historians presently are unprepared to accept could possibly have existed 10,000 years ago. And therefore, proof that these structures are man-made, and indeed, if we can get to it, that they may be 10,000 years old, is by definition going to force a revision of history.
The common knowledge is that the southwestern islands have no history of old civilizations. So if a 10,000-year-old civilization existed, it would be a big surprise. It would be unbelievable.
According to experts, around 8000 BC, we were primarily hunter-gatherers, nomadic, unorganized clans who had only the most rudimentary stone tools. Certainly not the kind of society capable of creating the Yonaguni Monument.
The general scenario for the rise of what we would call civilization or sophisticated civilization is that it begins in Mesopotamia and Egypt around 3000 BC.
John Anthony West has written a number of books about the monuments of early humans. And West, like Hancock, believes that there is ample evidence throughout the Earth that a sophisticated Ice Age civilization could have existed, a civilization described for millennia in the oral histories of many cultures.
It's very important to remember that there are large numbers of ancient traditions that refer to a lost civilization destroyed by a flood.
But until the discovery of the Yonaguni Monument, tangible evidence to support these ancient myths was lacking.
There was no known evidence of megalithic structures, monumental building, even say in the 3000 BC range. And if this was going back to maybe 6,000 or 8,000 BC, that was even more stupendous.
Over the years, as I've spent more time at Yonaguni, I've become more and more convinced that it is the work of human beings, and that the real mysteries that confront us now are not, was this made by man, but when was it made? Who made it, and what was it made for?
Professor Masaaki Kimura believes that the latest possible date for the creation of the Yonaguni Monument is around 8000 BC, when this part of Japan was still above water. But if this date is correct, and if the monument is man-made, who are the men who built it? For an answer, it is necessary to turn to legend. Around 360 BC, the Greek philosopher Plato writes down for the first time what until then had been only an oral tradition in the West. It is the legend of Atlantis, a civilization of technologically advanced people who flourished around 10,000 BC. But this vision of a great prehistoric society is not Plato's alone. Atlantean-like legends exist on every continent. And in Asia and the South Pacific, there is a rich tradition of ancient texts that all tell a strikingly similar story. It is this shared vision of the distant past that leads some to explore the possibility that such a civilization may have existed in fact as well as fiction.
In my mind, it's quite conceivable that there are some very ancient, relatively sophisticated cultures and civilizations that we've missed up until now that had existed basically when extinct, if you would, or collapsed before the rise of better known civilizations about 3500 BC.
Ancient writings from China describe a place called Pengsha, an island to the east inhabited by human beings who could fly and had a potion for eternal life. The inhabitants of Easter Island believe that they are the descendants of a kingdom of gods called Hiva. The oldest of all Hawaiian sacred chants recounts the arrival of a magical race of people from a floating island to the west called Mu.
Yonaguni Monument may be conspicuous evidence signifying that the Mu continent existed.
Yonaguni potentially could tie in with this. In fact, I'm very certain that we should at least look to see if there's something there of sort of a, if you want to call it proto-culture or proto-civilization that we're all descended from.
And whether it is called Mu, Pengsha, or Atlantis, all of these legendary places share one common thread, that the great and ancient civilization of which they speak is destroyed by a terrible flood.
There are more than 600 individual flood myths found all around the world.
The people who made this monument may have been interested in using it for directional bearing or because of some type of astronomical significance. Near the monument, there is a stone which we call sunstone. Now, I'm not sure if it was used as a sundial or for some religious purpose, but the long hand of the stone does point to the north and south.
Could it be that the monument of Yonaguni is the birthplace of the Atlantean legends, flood myths, and shared knowledge of the past? Or is it simply a collection of rocks and a collection of coincidences? The mainstream scientific community is inclined to believe the latter.
Archaeologists and historians regard themselves, rightly, as the specialists in our culture on the past. They do like to feel that they know everything that needs to be known about the past. And so the idea of a very major forgotten episode is a bit threatening, I think. And when a very interesting phenomenon like the underwater structures of Yonaguni is found, instead of rationally and intelligently investigating that phenomenon and coming to conclusions, most academics just write it off at the outset and don't even want to know.
In the 1960s, amateur archaeologists tout this rock formation in the Caribbean as the Bimini Road, a man-made highway to Atlantis. Geologists insist it is fractured beach rock. And in the 1980s, Russian divers claim they have discovered structures of Atlantean proportions off the Azores in the middle of the Atlantic, but still have yet to produce photographs from that expedition. Is Yonaguni just another Bimini Road, or is it the smoking gun? In 1997, Dr. Robert Schoch arrives on Yonaguni Island. He is the first Western academic to dive the monument, perhaps because he prides himself on working both inside and outside the mainstream.
So I was not someone that was going over there, should we say, dogmatically skeptical that this could never be the case. I was open to the possibility that here in Japan we had a very ancient structure.
Almost immediately, however, Dr. Schoch notes something that will be a harbinger of discoveries to come.
I went right down to the coastline, and you could see very dramatically the waves tearing at the rock and breaking it off and actually forming this step-like structure.
On his first dive, Dr. Schoch is escorted to the site of the Yonaguni Monument by Hihechiro Aratake, who discovered the site in 1987. They dive with writers John Anthony West and Graham Hancock. As they approach the monument through a narrow passageway, each has his own impressions.
On each side of the passageway we see two courses of megaliths piled on top of each other, and the joints between the megaliths are at exactly the same level on both sides of the passageway, completely roofed over with flat blocks, rather of the same shape as the classic goalposts of Stonehenge.
What I see is rock that seems to have fallen naturally. In some cases, harder rock may be sliding down softer rock and naturally working its way together as it collapsed on itself, forming a wall-like structure.
Through the passageway, the first view of the monument is the stunning megaliths dubbed the Twin Towers.
This is one of the many factors that convinces me that we're looking at a man-made structure here, because I find it very difficult to imagine how nature could have contrived to lower those two megalithic, rather neatly shaped blocks into position side by side, just 4 inches apart.
I found a lot of natural vertical fractures, and it started making sense to me how this beautiful structure, an incredibly regular structure, could in large part potentially be the result of natural processes.
Schock finds the same natural processes at work on the monument proper.
The way the beds are formed, the natural rock layers are formed, they flake off nice and horizontally, they're crisscrossed with nice vertical fractures and joints, they weather and they erode such that I believe you get nice step-like structures.
There will be what looks like an absolutely perfectly clear-cut, perfect horizontal, perfect vertical, but when you stick your mask down next to the corner, you see that it hasn't been cut, but rather that a chunk of rock has been wrenched away from its natural fault lines to produce this extraordinary formation.
However, based on his own dives at the site, Professor Kimura questions the erosion theory.
At the bottom of the monument, there are no rocks. If this were a natural creation, big rocks falling off of the monument would gather at the base.
Where the Yonaguni Monument is located, you've got incredibly strong currents and driving forces to actually split the rock, to pull off pieces, to wash them away nice and cleanly. You know, in nature, you can form magnificent structures, but that doesn't mean they're artificial.
And according to Schock, the right angles visible in photographs are actually deceptive. But could nature form the sharp right angles that argue so compellingly to some for artificiality?
I could not see the rock because it was covered with corals and sponges and algae, and they've actually, in my assessment, homogenized the surface. So it's like having sort of a rough, cruddy surface and you skim the whole thing with cement. In this case, natural cement, these biological organisms, it makes it look even more artificial, makes it look even more regular.
But several areas on the surface of the monument do not appear to Kimura to be caused by erosion or smoothed by sea scum.
There are 3 holes, all approximately 70 centimeters in diameter and lined up in a row.
These kinds of things do form naturally when there's a harder concretion, as it were, of like a boulder embedded in the shale, and the action of the water pulls the boulder away and you end up with a perfectly round hole.
2 of the holes are round, but the third has a hexagon shape, which could not have been created naturally. I think perhaps this hole was used to erect a post.
We find an internal right angle cut into the rock. Now, external right angles, one might argue, could result from erosion or wave action, but to find an internal right angle in a protected area is very puzzling indeed.
Again, Schock sees nature taking its course.
I looked at those little holes in great detail underwater on several different trips, and I see no evidence of actual chiseling, that they're artificial. My hypothesis is that what we have here is a natural weak joint or weak layer where little organisms have gotten in there, they sort of space themselves relatively regularly. So you've essentially got what are a series of regular holes, but I think they can be explained by natural means.
On the upper terrace of the monument, there are additional shapes and forms that also look like carvings.
Now, when I look at these, to me it's more, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, it's like looking at clouds and seeing shapes in the clouds.
Were I to focus on any one area of the Yonaguni monuments, I might be persuaded that it had been made by nature. But the combination of so many different features in this one area, for me, makes it extremely unlikely that nature could have done them all.
And if Hancock is willing to concede some natural forces at work on the monument, Schock is willing to hold out the possibility of some artificiality.
There's a few little things like some scar marks, potential scar marks that Professor Kimura has pointed out to me that could be artificial. We can't, in my opinion, exclude the possibility that there was some, should we say, utilization, even if it's primarily a natural structure, by ancient humans.
It was exactly the opposite of what we wanted to find, but up to now, we simply haven't found the kind of evidence that would allow us to go on believing what we wanted to believe, just because it looked.
Is the Yonaguni monuments, and I have a good video that I want to show you guys about the Yonaguni monuments, and then I'll come back and discuss them. Okay, the Yonaguni monuments, like you saw in the video, amazing, large, incredible, but completely natural. This is a natural formation, right? And the way you can tell that is by looking and seeing very closely that the geology around it mimics exactly what is going on underneath the ocean. Right? So this is a natural sandstone deposit that's been weathered into a fantastic shape, according to the lines of the stratigraphy of the sandstone. But misinterpreted by people like Graham Hancock, who you saw in the video, to be this major ceremonial complex, which doesn't make sense in many respects. There's no carvings on it. If they carved this huge thing, wouldn't they also carve images of iconography? Wouldn't there be carvings of other things? Also, if you think these are used as pools and things like that, they just don't. It doesn't look practical as a ceremonial complex. And why would you? If you're going to take a massive piece of stone and chip it down, sometimes it's easier, obviously, to build something straight up. So yeah, you could see that all over. There's no evidence of carving. There's no evidence of blocks being moved, but actually just natural erosion. It's a pretty amazing sight, though. When you look at it. And Robert Schock, who we're going to learn about in another lesson as well, who's the geologist who debunked the Bimini Road in the Bahamas, right? Studied this very, very closely. And like you saw in the video, when you look at the sandstone on the shore, you see that it looks exactly or very, very similar to what's going on underneath the water, right? So, I mean, if you only saw what's underneath the water, and that's usually what you see in books or on these, television programs, but if you were actually there and you docked your ship and then you walked around the area, you'd say, wow, this looks almost exactly like what's underneath the water. And this really doesn't look like it was carved by people. And then you look at some of the other sandstone in the area and you see the same sort of activity. Then you realize, oh, okay, it's natural. Yeah. So the roads are channels, again, produced by erosion. Here's some more deposits. You can see that there was uplift and tilting of the sediment deposits, right? So here you can see kind of the way things have eroded, right? So there's a little bit of uplift and tilt here you can see with the layers. Like we said before, sandstone erodes according to the sedimentary layers, right? The plants that have grown on the surface make it look more artificial than it really is. And there's archaeological evidence, right, for people living on the island, but it was relatively small in size, and they definitely were not there in large numbers during the Ice Age, when they think that the monument had to have been built because that's when it was actually not below sea level. So with a lot of these other things, you have to look at what is the other evidence, right? If we expect a monument this size, there had to have been a society large enough to build it. Right? Okay, so some good rules of thumb in terms of geology. What is the geology of the surrounding area? compared to what people are saying is a artificial construction. What is the rock that it's built out of? Are there any artifacts? Are there any associated monuments or settlements on shore or nearby? Right? These are all good clues. Okay, our next discussion is going to be a fun one I really like, called UPA, or UPART, out of place artifacts. This is also connected to geology, as we're going to see, because some of these out of place artifacts turn out to be geological features as well, right? So out of place, right? Something that you would not expect to be there, but is there. So we'll continue with this next time. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.